We're going to pick up tonight with Esau's birthright. That's where we left off a couple of weeks ago in Genesis chapter 25. Genesis chapter 25, if you want to turn there with me tonight. We're not going to look at every bit of it verse by verse. We're going to go over the story and talk about some of what we find there. Esau's birthright. Now, Esau, just to make sure we're up to speed, who remembers who Esau is? One of the twins. Okay, the firstborn of the twins to whom? Isaac. Very good. Isaac and Rebekah. All right. So when we come to this point in the story, Jacob and Esau are adults by now, 20 to 40 years old, somewhere in there. And Esau was his dad's favorite. We see this especially later on in another story we're going to look at tonight. But we know that Esau was kind of his dad's favorite. He was the outdoorsman. He was kind of a rough and tumble guy that his father could spend time with outside. And Jacob was more of a, mama's boy. I was going to be a little nicer, say he was a little more indoorsy. he favored the great indoors, but now he was favored by his mother. And this favoritism throughout their relationship led to rivalry, and it led to some resentment between the two of them, and it led to all sorts of trouble within the household. Now, as the firstborn, Esau was entitled to a greater share of the family inheritance as a matter of his birthright. And again, I told you, I don't know for sure how it worked with them. I've heard it explained a couple of different ways. One possibility is that the firstborn gets half the inheritance and all the others split it, although for Jacob that doesn't really make a difference because he's the only other son arguing over the other half of the inheritance. So in a situation like that, apply it to my family, and it would be Benjamin gets half of everything, and then the other four, fight over the other half. So that was an eighth. They each get an eighth. It doesn't seem right in a number of ways. Another way I've heard it explained is that the firstborn just gets a double share. So in that case, 5 children, you divide the inheritance in 6 parts. Benjamin gets 2 of those parts, so he gets a third of the inheritance, and the others all get a sixth. It's probably the latter in this case. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been mathematically it wouldn't have been an issue. But here, if that's the case, then Esau's getting 2/3 of the inheritance when his father died. But not only that, the birthright and the rights of the firstborn were also a matter of prominence. You wanted to be the head of the family. There were other benefits to that as well. So Esau was entitled to this certain rights as the firstborn, and Jacob was entitled to what was left. But he wasn't content with his share. I was going to say fair share, but I don't know that it was fair. It was just more tradition. So he devised a plan to help himself to Esau's share as well. And my share is not enough. I'll just have everybody's share. And so starting in verse 29, we see that one day Esau came in exhausted. He had been outside, he had been hunting, he had been doing all the things that Esau would do, and his hard work had made him hungry. And so he asked Jacob to prepare him some food. Jacob was in there cooking, heard different descriptions of the stuff he was cooking. It sounds to me like a lot like red beans and rice. And I don't know, I think I might be a little tempted too, but Esau smells the food cooking and says, "Why don't you make me a bowl of that?" Jacob plays it cool and he says, "All right, I'll make you a bowl of what I'm cooking in exchange for your birthright, in exchange for your share of the inheritance." Now, Esau was clearly not a great businessman because he says, okay. Actually, he was a little more dramatic than that. His answer was, "What good is my birthright to me if I starve to death?" You can almost hear it's a little bankhead or Benny Davis. If you don't know who that is, I know Tallulah from I Love Lucy, all right? As a matter of fact, we used to call Madeline Tallulah because she'd be so dramatic. And so, knock it off, Tallulah, you're fine. Anyway. But he had one of those moments. What good would my birthright be? Starved to death. I don't think he was literally about to starve to death, but that's what he said. My birthright would be useless to me if I died here of starvation. And so in verse 33, he agreed to Jacob's terms, promising Jacob his birthright. He sold his birthright. He sold probably 2/3 of the wealth in Isaac's household to his brother for a bowl of beans. That was awfully short-sighted. I think of that picture that people post on Facebook. They'll post something else going on, and then underneath it will be a picture of Trump saying this is the worst trade deal in the history of trade deals. Right? This is the worst trade deal in the history of the world. He agrees to this. So Jacob brought Esau some bread and some lentil stew, and with this exchange, Esau temporarily filled his stomach. He got what he wanted in the short term, but Jacob also became the sole inheritor of his father's household. He's entitled to everything. Which later on makes Esau mad, but he agreed to it. So let me ask you this question. Actually, there's a few questions I want to ask, but I want to start with this one. Who was right in this situation and who was wrong? And I don't know that there's a single answer to this. They were both wrong? Okay. Why do you say that?
First of all, Esau should have been smart enough to be the oldest.
Okay. So Esau just wasn't thinking clearly. Okay.
So you don't make a decision after you've plowed your food.
Yes.
You go in and you rest and take a bath and eat.
Very good. Don't make decisions when you're hungry, right? Yeah. Or really when you're tired, when you're exhausted. There are a lot of things that play. You make decisions when you're a little more sober-minded. Okay. Right. He could have been more hospitable, but he had this plan. This was a schemer. He was a schemer. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. The reason I asked this question, who was right here and who was wrong, I always heard this story taught as, Jacob was greedy here, and poor pitiful Esau, he was tricked. And I thought he wasn't tricked; he was a grown man. He reasoned this. We can argue, we can disagree with his reasoning, but he reasoned this out in his mind. What good is it to me if I die right here? He knew that he was selling his birthright for a bowl of beans, and then he got mad about it later. But you've got to hold Esau responsible here a little bit for saying, come on, man, you had to know what you were doing, and you cared, at least at that moment, you cared so little about your father's inheritance and your birthright, you cared so little about that you were willing to trade it for all of this. And at some point, we've got to say, no, you weren't thinking clearly. You were just in the moment, acting on impulse and what seemed right at the moment. And that, I don't know about your life, but that doesn't usually work out well for me. I'm just going with what seems good in the moment, when I'm tired or when I'm hungry or something else. So I think they were both wrong. Anything else on that? Why, and we've already kind of hit on this a little bit, but why would Esau make such a foolish bargain? That's possible. That's a good point. Maybe he thought his wouldn't hold him to the deal. That's possible.
Well, even then, it was, they could sell their birthright under certain conditions, but it wasn't his yet. So perhaps he thought, well, okay, you're going here because I'm the one, I'm the older child, I'm going to get this. My father's going to give it to me. And so it's a big deal to me that. But then when you get down to that last part where it says, he despised his birthright. So that's a big question mark for that. That was my thought. He didn't think he was actually selling his birthright.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. They could sell the birthright under certain circumstances, and maybe he thought, well, I'll win it back. But they could sell it under certain circumstances, but as Linda said, it wasn't his yet, and so maybe he thought, maybe it's one of those situations where the contract is null and void as soon as it's signed, and he thought his dad was going to overrule it and give it to him anyway. That's possible. There is that phrase, he despised his birthright. I believe that comes at the end of the story. Yeah. Thus Esau despised his birthright. I could see all of this would make Esau's thought process would make total sense here if he despised his birthright from the beginning, if he was coming to it as, I don't care, what's it to me? But it's only at the end after he's lost it. He's like, wasn't anything anyway. And I don't know, that kind of reminds me of my children when they'll be, the older children will be super competitive with each other and act like whatever they're competing over is the most important thing in the world until one of them loses, and then that was like, it didn't matter anyway. You know, it's sort of that thought process. And here Esau comes to think, I didn't want this stupid birthright anyway. Apparently not, at least in that moment, he didn't value it. Was that a reflection on, does that reflect at all on his respect for his father, do you think? Some of you are shaking your heads. Some of you are looking at me like you think it's a trick question. I'm not trying to play gotcha here.
Well, if I'm going and look at what it said in Hebrew. Hebrews about this situation where it called Esau a profane person.
Okay.
And that indicates to me that there was some question of his honor and his behavior, perhaps to his father, to his brother, to his mother, even in whatever the situation is. But it called him a profane person.
Is that in chapter 11?
Chapter 12.
Chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12 calls Esau a profane person. So this could have just been a character trait, even more than a spur of the moment, a moment of weakness. But I think this is one of the clearest stories in Scripture that point out to us the dangers of making those kinds of decisions when we are in a weakened state, not thinking clearly. And the Bible all through it tells us, the book of Proverbs talks about needing to be wise in our decision making. And this is one of those instances, one of those cautionary tales that points to us what can happen when we're not thinking about the long-term consequences of decisions. So why does this story matter in the overall story of the Bible?
Change the whole complexion of what's going to happen.
Okay. How so?
Well, with what happened later, with Jacob getting the blessing from his father. He's already entitled to his birthright, and he's got the blessing, and then it becomes Jacob, whose life matters, and the prestige that he has.
Yeah.
And then through his line is going to be the saving of Israel.
Right. Okay. Yeah, this is sort of the beginning of Jacob coming to prominence. This is one of many examples of what I've talked to you about too, of God showing favor to the second son as opposed to the first, which was contrary to everything that we see in ancient culture, that God would call the second son. This is the beginning of that, and Jacob is the forerunner of the nation of Israel. It's through him that the nation of Israel comes to prominence in God's story. It's through that lineage that Jesus comes into the world. He was not somebody you'd want to buy a used car from. Yeah. Good point. God could use anybody.
It's that God uses.
Yeah, God can use it.
God had an encounter with God
Right.
all the time. It's changed. It happens.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's true. Yeah, God can use us no matter where He finds us, but God using us has a tremendous potential to transform us. And that's what we see time. Some of these people we talk about. Well, King David did this, Moses did this, the Apostle Paul did this. That was all before God. Transformed them.
And then to the selection of the person who's going to allow himself to be used. And just from my reading of this, it's like I get the idea that he thought was very arrogant. And he wasn't the right choice for what God wanted done. So we're not given the background.
Right.
We don't know what that backstory is.
There's a lot about the family dynamic that I wish I knew before this. But yeah, I think you're right. Jacob was, even in all his flaws, Jacob was suited to the task that God was calling him for, where Esau was not necessarily willing to be used of God. Just from another historical standpoint, Esau is the ancestor of the nation of people called the Edomites, who are constantly at war with Israel up through the book of Obadiah, which I did a series on the book of Obadiah back in 2019. I don't know why I picked that book, but I did on Sunday nights. It was fascinating to go through the prophecy of Obadiah and how this conflict came to a head. All right, let's move on to the next story here, Esau's blessing. In chapter 27 and the beginning of chapter 28. So by the time Isaac was old, he desired to bless Esau. This was a thing that they would do. They would bring in their children. They would bless them. Now I think it would be a good thing to do today. But in our culture, if we were to do that to our children, put your hands on them and pray over them and say, "May God," what are you doing? They would think it's weird because we don't do this, but I think it would be an important thing for us to do. So he wanted to offer a blessing over Esau, who was very clearly his favorite child, and he wanted to do this before he died. And so he called Esau to him. He said, "Before I bless you, I want you to take your hunting gear. I want you to go out into the field. I want you to hunt some meat. I want you to prepare it for me. I want you to bring it back to me and feed me, and I'm going to bless you." He enjoyed the meat that Esau would catch, and he wanted to have that meal and that time together as he blessed him. Now, Rebekah overheard their conversation, and she devised a plan to help Jacob, who was her favorite child, as Brother Jeff said, mama's boy. Right. And so she told Jacob, "Bring 2 young goats so that I can prepare them for your dad. While Esau's out trying to hunt down some deer, go get some of your goats that you raised, and I'll cook them, and then I'll send you in there." But Jacob realized there's a hole in this plan. That even as blind as Dad is, he's going to be able to tell that I'm not Esau. Does anybody remember how he knew his dad would be able to tell? Hair. Yeah, verses 11 and 12. Esau was a very hairy man. Jacob was not so much. And so he said, Dad is never going to think that my baby face is Esau. Rebecca dressed Jacob in Esau's clothes, and she said, I've got a plan. She took the goat skins, where he had slaughtered these goats for her to prepare them. She then took the skins and she wrapped them around his arms and on his neck to simulate hair. And so Jacob impersonated his brother and took the food into his father Isaac there in verse 18. Now Isaac is skeptical. He said, are you sure that's you? I'm sure they sounded different as well. Are you sure that's you? Yeah, it's me. I don't believe it's you. Oh, it's me. You sure it's you? They kind of go back and forth with this, and finally, Jacob comes over to Isaac, who says, here, let me feel on you. Feels his arms, and I don't know, he was prescient enough to realize the voice sounded different, but he was fooled by the goat hair on the arms. I don't know, maybe Esau just really was that hairy. But the goat skins were enough to convince him, and so he blessed Jacob. And we see this in verses 28 and 29. He says, therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you, and nations bow down to you. And by the way, he says here, let peoples serve you. That's not a grammar mistake in the Bible. That's talking about entire people groups, what we would call as ethnicities. And nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. It's a pretty good blessing. He said, I want you to go out, and I want all the dew that God sends from heaven to be yours, and all the stuff that the earth produces to be yours, plenty of grain and wine. I want entire nations to bow down and serve you, and you're going to be master over all your brothers, and may God repay anybody for the way they treat you. I mean, that's a pretty good deal. So he received that blessing. Then starting in verse 30, Esau returned, and he comes into his father with the venison that he had caught and prepared. He comes in and says, Dad, I'm back. It's time for my blessing. He says, who are you? I already gave you your blessing. No, you didn't. Yeah, I did. Wait, who did I bless? He realized he had given away Esau's blessing to Jacob, and he had nothing substantial left to offer his son. Certainly nothing like what he had intended to give him. He says, I've already given away your blessing. And Esau says, do you not have anything left for me? And here's how Isaac blesses him. Verse 39 and 40. Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. It sounds pretty similar, but where Isaac is blessing Jacob to own these things and receive them for them to be his, he's blessing Esau with just the opportunity to live there. Basically, he's getting the scraps from Jacob's table. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. So he says you're gonna need your wits and your strength to survive, and you're going to end up serving your brother. And it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break his yoke from your neck. So basically, the best that he could offer him is that he would enjoy for a time his life in his brother's shadow, and then when it got to be too much for him, he'd be able to break free. But as far as him ever being in the sunlight, as far as him ever owning and being the master and all these things, that was already given to Jacob. Now Esau at this point is mad. He is enraged. Not only has he lost his birthright, he's lost his blessing, he has lost everything. So in his rage, he decides to kill Jacob. Now Rebekah hears what's being planned, and she warned Jacob. She sent him away to safety with her brother Laban, and she promised him that she would call him to come home once Esau had calmed down. She's thinking, eventually Esau is this will blow over, he's going to get over the fact that he's lost everything, that you've taken everything in his entire life. I mean, we get over things like that, right? Yeah, seems like a good plan. She promised she'd call him once he calms down. Once the coast is clear, I'll notify you, and you can come home. And so he goes off, and he runs off to Laban. Now, why was Isaac's blessing so important to Jacob and Esau? Why did they care so much while he was proclaiming it? Okay? He is close to God. Okay? God had made promises to Isaac and to Abraham before him. Now, there's a group called the Word of Faith movement. As a matter of fact, probably 90% of what you'll see on TV is called the Word of Faith movement. And just to, I don't want to oversimplify, but basically they believe that faith is an active force that you can use to create reality, and words are containers that hold that faith, and when they're combined, you can move mountains that way. Basically, you can obligate God to what you want to happen. It's sort of what we've called for years, name it and claim it. And then if you say this with enough faith, then God is obligated to do what we've said and what we've believed and what we've claimed in His name. I don't believe that the Word of Faith movement by and large is good. I think it's based off of a misinterpretation of some things that we read in Scripture. By them looking for these blessings, and by Isaac giving the blessing, are they trying to obligate God to do certain things, or is there something else at work here? I realize that's a hard question.
I think it has to do with both. Okay. Not only of the promises that were made, we're certain that was talked about a lot, but also their whole standing as far as the riches. So we can throw greed in there a little bit, and then the way they perceive themselves and how they're perceived with everybody around them. Their standing in the community. So I think it's a little bit of everything thrown in there at so very important to have a birthright and
I got a picture and using.
You mean Jacob and Esau, or the people that I was talking about? Okay, yeah, there is a lot of focus on the material, and that goes back to what you were saying about their standing in the community. It wasn't just oh, that guy's rich, but if you were rich in that day, we think of it that way now, that if you're rich, the world seems to think you're more important, but it was definitely true that people thought that way. Even to the point that you were more loved by God if you were rich, is the way they thought about it. The reason I asked that about the Word of Faith movement is because I want us to understand why they were claiming certain things, and yet that doesn't apply to us today, that we can just name and claim whatever we want from God. And Linda pointed out something very, very early in what you said. You're talking about the promises of God. I think that's the difference, because we need to understand this, because it's so easy to fall into this trap of, well, whatever I claim and confess from God, whatever I speak out there, I can make happen. And then when it doesn't, we feel like either God didn't come through, or I just didn't have enough faith, we put all this pressure on ourselves. We need to understand the difference between what they were doing and what people try to do today. And the difference is the promises. They are claiming something that God has already promised. Because God told Abraham a few things. You remember some of what God promised to Abraham?
Children and the stars.
Okay, more children than the stars, absolutely.
And through him, every nation would be blessed.
Yeah. He talks about the prominence of Abraham's descendants. He talks about blessing Abraham in all these ways and his descendants. And then he said the same thing to Isaac, that he's going to bless him in all these ways and his descendants. They were simply, I think, they were simply passing down what God had already promised to them and their descendants and saying, this goes to you. Now, if I were to say to Benjamin, may God give you a BMW. Rick rented one in Nashville. Pretty cool. All right. we rode in that thing to dinner. I said, I'm out here in a Hyundai. You get to drive. But Benjamin, may God bless you with a BMW. Am I blessing him with something that is mine to give? Only if I have it, yeah. May God bless you with my 20-year-old pickup. I can do that. Or, no, Benjamin just says, can I have your watch when you're dead? Stop asking me that about everything. If I were to say, may God bless you with a BMW, may God bless you with a mansion on a hill, that's not really mine to bind God to. But there are things that God has promised. Benjamin has professed faith in Jesus Christ, and I believe it's genuine. I've seen evidence that it's genuine. So for me to say, Benjamin, may God continue to gift you with His Holy Spirit. May God continue to grow you to be more like Christ. I'm speaking into his life things that God has already said He wants to give to a believer. And I think that's the difference here. They were claiming promises that God had already made. And so I just say that because as we talk about the importance of blessing our children and being blessed, we don't want to go to an unbiblical extreme like some people would today and say, I'm going to make and claim promises that God hasn't made. God has not promised me a BMW for my son. I don't think I'd want one because the taxes I pay. God hasn't promised all these things to me. God had promised that to this family and to their descendants. And so He's simply passing on the promise that God has already made. At least that's what I'm thinking at this point. If you have another biblical answer to that, I'm all yours. Anything else on this? I ran way far away from the initial question, why was the blessing so important? But I think Linda hit on that. It was tied to everything about who they were and who they were in the community. Oh, so what role did Isaac and Rebekah play in the conflict between their sons? Okay. Yeah.
There was a very knowing manipulation going on her part, and then he was unwittingly used, and then blessing that he gave to Jacob. And then look at what he said to Esau. I think we talked about it the other way around, but nevertheless, they was well aware of what she was doing, and then being not aware, but yet doing it, made all the difference in the world, and these two people's lives.
Yeah, that's true. There was a clear manipulation is a good word for it. I think it starts early on when you see the parents gravitating toward one child versus the other, where Jacob is mom's favorite and Esau is dad's favorite. Then you get to this story, and it's intensified even, where they are actively working against other members of the family. Even husband and wife were not on the same page because they had these alliances, it reminds me of Survivor and other shows like that I hate. They're trying to form these alliances and manipulate each other and backstab each other, and it's a terrible way to run a family. And it's probably at the heart of why the boys were such rivals to begin with, because they had to compete for their parents' affection. They had to compete for their parents' approval. This kind of thing scares me to death, honestly. There are periods of time where I'll spend more time with one child than another. Just it's the way it works out. Benjamin wants to work outside with me, except for when he's in the family. Sure. He's told go to Jeff. That's the thing he needs the most. But he likes to work outside with me, so I'll spend a weekend working outside and him with me. And then I kind of feel bad that Madeline's left out, so I'll take Madeline to lunch and shopping, and then Benjamin's like, well, why didn't I get to go shopping? And meanwhile, Charlie just wants to go wherever in the truck. I worry about the kids feeling like there's a favorite and try to actively not do that, because I can see where this kind of conflict in the family can mess everything up. Do you have something to... Oh, you look like you're going to say something.
Lady's been doing our Bible studies in her family, and each one of them
That's good.
say they'll say, I was the favorite.
A lot of work with 7 to make each of them feel like the favorite. Yeah. I tell my kids all the time, I don't have a favorite child. I sometimes have a least favorite child, and it changes from day to day. Actually, Benjamin asked me a year or two ago who my favorite child was, and I told him Max. That was the dog. I said, I'm leaving everything to Max. And y'all better be nice to Max, because he decides what you get. Anyway. So the story of Jacob taking Esau's blessing. Why does this story matter in the overall story of the Bible?
Again, I think tying it back into when Jacob came out and grabbed Esau's heel, and that symbolism there of taking or holding Esau back, kind of placing to what happened with mom and dad, and then change the whole future for these two men.
Yeah, so it kind of ties in with the same things we discussed with the birthright, that it's changing the direction of the family and changing who's going to come to prominence, who God is going to use. And that's important, because all of this is setting everything up for the nation of Israel to come into existence. I think that's a big part of the importance of the story. Finding out how we get from Adam to Israel, and how God plans to play out there. All right, I'm looking at the time. I think we can get through this next story fairly quickly, so we'll do that. Jacob's ladder is in Genesis chapter 28. So Jacob, as he was running for his life from his angry brother, he stopped one night to sleep on the ground. And the Bible talks about him using stones as a pillow. And while he was asleep, he had a dream or a vision, whatever you want to call it, of a ladder. And Jacob is convinced, and the writer of Genesis, inspired by the Holy Spirit, is convinced that this was a vision from God. It's not just something he dreamed up in his mind. He had this dream or this vision of a ladder that reached from heaven, reached from earth all the way up to heaven. And as he's looking at this ladder, we see in verse 12 that the angels are repeatedly passing up and down on this ladder between heaven and earth. And as Jacob is looking at this ladder, God began to speak to him. God was standing next to the ladder and spoke to Jacob. And he promised Jacob that he would continue to keep the promises that he had given to Abraham and fulfill those through Jacob's family. He said, all those promises that I made to Abraham, they're going to be fulfilled through you. Now, some of the ones that he specifically mentions in verse 13 are that they would receive the land of Canaan. So this land that God promised to Abraham, he said, it's going to be yours, Jacob. That he was going to, in verse 14, that he was going to multiply Jacob's descendants to be as numerous as the dust of the earth. And also in verse 14, that through Jacob's family, they're going to be a blessing to all the nations of the world. So basically, he took all of these promises to Abraham and said that they're going to be fulfilled through you. Now Jacob awoke and he praised God. He built a monument, an altar on that spot. And he made the monument from the stone where he had rested his head. And he promised that if God fulfilled his promises to protect him, which I don't know why he thought he wouldn't, but Lord, if you'll protect me on my journey, provide for me on my journey, I'll serve you from then on. It's kind of a turning point. Jacob still is not a perfect man after this, but Jacob is a little more committed to God from this point on. So, what is the significance of the ladder to the story? Why is there? I'm not sure I have a great answer to this.
Dr. Miles said that he explained was that Jesus, Jacob's ladder, and in that, I'm going to be helped, and also he's going to be born in the future somewhere.
Right. I've read that the Jacob's ladder is a representation of Jesus as this connection between heaven and earth.
Mine says it's a metaphor of God's eternal desire to communicate.
Okay. Which he did ultimately fulfill through Jesus. A symbol of God's eternal desire to communicate with human beings. That's good. How much of this do you think Jacob understood? We can look back and see the symbolism. What do you think Jacob understood about the ladder?
I don't think a lot.
Just
I think he was
awesome ladder.
what was going on and just realizing that there was something supernatural happening, but I'm not sure he knew that.
Yeah, that's. I mean, yeah, we can look back on it now. I can give you an answer, and I think y'all hit the nail on the head. The answer of the significance to us, but I wondered, what did Jacob think he was looking at? It may be like any of us would do if we were in the same circumstance. Just, wow, that may have been all he thought. Now there is there are other events in the book of Genesis that involve structures reaching to heaven. Can you think of one? The Tower of Babel. Give the girl a prize. The Tower of Babel. Huh? Partially. Yeah, when they were going to go build the Tower of Babel, man said, let us build a tower and it will reach all the way to the heavens. What happened there? They found out it was not going to happen. Yeah. God came down and he scattered everybody, right? But we see here in verse 12, let me get back to it now. Verse 12, we see here a structure that actually does reach to heaven. Then he dreamed, and behold, a ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached to heaven. And there the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Who built the Tower of Babel?
Yeah.
Man. Who built Jacob's ladder? Who put it there? God did. One was able to bridge the gap. One was not. What does that tell us? We're not God. That's important to remember always and always. All things are possible with God. How does this story then point us to Jesus Christ? Who can bridge the gap between God and man? Jesus. Only God can bridge that, right? It's impossible for us to reach Him. He had to do what? He had to reach us. I think that's really important, and probably answers the final question: why does this story matter in the overall story of the Bible? Other than being a turning point for Jacob, I think it's one of those instances that point us to. I won't say that it's something that somebody in the Old Testament would look at and say, God's going to send His Son. But it's just another one of those things that point toward Jesus. We can see from hindsight that God was saying, you can't bridge this gap only I can. And the way you can do that was through Jesus. Any more questions or comments on any of these stories that we've looked at? Yes, sir.
I heard you said, microcosm of the whole thing, you know, the born again, our first born, it was the second Adam. Yeah. The second Adam did get it. The second Adam was Jesus. Yeah. First Adam. And you see it all the way through here. See it on Cain and Abel. The firstborn was supposed to be the honored one, but it's the next one. Yeah. Second one is in our life. Our earthly birth is going to be reborn, and if we were born again,
I think you're exactly right. Yeah. What he said was that this is a picture of how, you know, our first birth doesn't count. As Jesus said, you must be born again. And so it's not the first one, it's the second one that moves forward. And that's again one of those pictures. By itself, nobody then looked at that and said, oh, the Father's going to send the Son. Nobody said that. But it was preparing them for that idea that God takes the second one, the second birth. You're absolutely right.
Also, when I taught that Sunday school, I called it this dysfunctional family.
Yes.
That's not a new deal.
No, okay. No.
And even Abraham was dead, you know. God called Abraham. Yeah. He gave up on the promise and Abraham took over. He did not say it was all. This notion was you get all the way through rebirth.
That's right. People today think that dysfunctional families are new, but they've already been there and got a t-shirt. And yet God still used them. All right. If God didn't use broken people, there wouldn't be any people at all to use.